The mud did not want to give him back. It had taken so many, swallowed boots and helmets and men whole, pulled them down into its cold, anonymous dark with the patient indifference of a grave that had stopped counting. The trench Crusader world was generous with its mud. It stretched from horizon to horizon across the Veldenmarch front, a gray-brown ocean frozen mid-churn by the cold, stippled with the black fingers of shattered timber and the occasional pale suggestion of a face that had not been recovered in time. It smelled of cordite, in old iron, and something sweetly wrong beneath both, the way a wound smells when it has been left too long in a boot. Private Hank Marsal found the body just before dawn. He almost didn't stop. Bodies were furniture out here. You noted them, you stepped around them. You did not look at the faces unless you had to, because looking at faces was how you started counting, and counting was how you went quiet, and men who went quiet in the Veldenmarch didn't come back loud. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the coat. No man in the trench Crusader armies wore a coat like that, long and black and severe, with the kind of gold detailing that spoke not of wealth, but of office, of rank worn like armor. Maybe it was the arm. The left arm was not an arm at all, but a claw of blackened metal, massive and incongruous, half buried in the mud like the hand of something that had tried to drag the body down and lost its grip. Marsal crouched. He reached out and touched the claw with two fingers, the way you touch something you're not sure is safe. The eye opened. Not the right eye. That was closed. Not the face beneath it, an old man's face, seamed and hard and carrying the particular weathering of someone who had spent decades standing in places where other men ran. The left eye opened. It was red. Not bloodshot red, not the red of fever or weeping, but a deep arterial mechanical crimson that lit the mud around it in a small fierce circle. And it found Marsal's face immediately and with absolute precision, the way a gun sight finds a target. Marsal fell backward into the mud and made a sound he would not describe to anyone later. The old man's right eye opened too, brown and very tired and furious in the particular way of a man who has just been interrupted in the middle of something important. "Stop that," the old man said. His voice was a ruined thing, scraped raw, but it carried. It carried the way commands carry, not through volume, but through expectation of compliance. "Get up! What front is this?" Marsal's mouth worked without sound. "I asked you a question, soldier." The Veldenmarch, sir. Third lateral trench, section 9. Marsal was on his feet before he'd decided to stand. "Some voices did that to you." You were dead, sir." "I checked. You weren't. There wasn't any. I am aware of what I was." The old man sat up. The mud released him with a sound like a seal breaking, a wet, reluctant exhalation, and he came upright slowly, methodically, the way old machinery comes to life. Each joint a negotiation, each movement deliberate, nothing wasted. The power claw dragged free of the earth and hung at his side, caked to the elbow in gray-brown filth. He looked at it with brief professional displeasure and then looked at Marsal. "Your regiment, 4th Veldenmarch Fusiliers, sir, attached to the Crusade of the Bleeding Stave under Marshal Antonin Corvath." "I don't know that name, or that crusade." The old man's red eye moved across the trench line with slow methodical sweep, cataloging, filing. "I don't know this world, sir." "That is not a complaint." He found the lip of the trench and pulled himself upright against it, the power claw biting into the timber revetment for purchase. Standing, he was not tall, but he occupied space the way fortifications occupy space, not through size, but through the absolute statement of his presence. The coat was ruined. The insignia on his cap meant nothing here. It didn't matter. It had never been the insignia. "What is that sound to the northeast?" Marsal listened. He'd stopped hearing it months ago the way you stop hearing rain. "Artillery, sir. They've been shelling the St. Ambrose salient since yesterday evening. We expect an advance at—" "Then we don't have time for your shock." The old man turned and looked at him directly, and Marsal felt the red eye the way you feel a lamp held close. Not painful, but impossible to ignore. "Find me your commanding officer. Find me a map if one exists. Find me water if it doesn't cost someone their ration." A pause. What is your name? Marsal, sir. Hank Marsal. Marsal. The syllables were weighed and stored. You found me. That means you're responsible for me until I am someone else's problem. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. Move. Word moved faster than Marsal did. By the time they had covered 50 meters of trench line toward the command dugout, men were stopping. Not blocking the path. These were soldiers, they knew better than to block. But stopping, pressing back against the timber walls, staring. The word that moved ahead of them was not stranger or survivor. The word that moved ahead of them was whispered, and it was a name, though none of them could have said where they'd heard it. It passed from mouth to mouth the way fever passes, the way prayer passes in a dark church when the candles have guttered out, and the only light left is the one inside the chest. Saint, some of them whispered. A saint has come up out of the mud. Yarrick heard it. His jaw tightened by a fraction. He said nothing. Not yet. There would be time for that conversation, and it would not be a comfortable one. And it would need to happen in front of the officer with the map, and not here in the open, where every frightened man with a rifle could hear the answer and draw the wrong conclusions. He had spent 50 years managing the distance between what men believed about him and what he actually was, and he was not about to let a trench full of strangers collapse that distance in a dawn he hadn't expected to see. He was dead. He knew he was dead. The last thing he remembered was the cold and the noise, and something vast and contemptuous bending over him with a mouthful of stars. And then nothing. And then mud. And then a boy with frightened eyes and a rifle that hadn't been designed in any forge he recognized. He did not know what this place was. He knew exactly what it needed. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The command dugout of Section 9 smelled like every command post Yarrick had ever occupied. Tallow candles burning low, damp paper slowly surrendering its ink to the moisture in the walls. The particular staleness of men who had been thinking hard in an enclosed space for too long. A map was pinned to a board of salvaged timber. A votive candle burned beneath a painted icon. A man in a coat with more braid than Marsal's stood over the map with a grease pencil and the expression of someone who had not slept in 2 days and had stopped expecting to. Captain Edvard Saul looked up when Yarrick entered. He was a compact man, 40 or close to it, with the kind of face that had started hard and been made harder by weather and responsibility. His eyes went first to the coat, then to the power claw, then to the bale eye, which was casting its low red light across the dugout wall in a way that made the icon's painted face look briefly, unsettlingly alive. Saul's grease pencil stopped moving. "Sir," Marsal said from behind Yarrick, "I found him in the mud outside Section 9's eastern lip. He appeared to be dead, sir. He wasn't." Saul said nothing for a long moment, then quietly to Yarrick, "Who are you?" "Sebastian Yarrick. Commissar, I do not belong to your order of battle, and I cannot explain my presence here to your satisfaction, so I will not waste your time attempting it. What I can tell you is that I have been reading your map from the doorway for the last 30 seconds, and the salient at St. Ambrose is going to collapse before midday if you don't pull your reserve section off the Holt Road and anchor it to the northeastern corner." He crossed to the map and put the tip of one metal finger on the relevant position. "Here. The ground is higher and the approach is channeled by the ruined mill structure. Whoever is shelling you knows this. They are pushing you toward your own wire." Saul stared at the map, then at Yarrick, then at the map again. "How do you? I have been reading ground for 50 years. The specifics of your theology and your political situation are unknown to me. Artillery and mud are not." Yarrick withdrew his claw from the map and turned to face Saul fully. "I need water. A briefing on your enemy's known capabilities, and a straight answer to one question before anything else. After that, I will be useful to you or I won't, and we'll know which quickly." Saul found his voice. "What's the question?" "What killed the man whose position in this trench I am apparently filling?" A silence. Saul set down the grease pencil carefully. "Father Commissar Aldrich. He was He held the line at the bitter crossing 2 weeks ago. The enemy brought a reliquary weapon, something old. It burned through the blessing wards on the forward parapet, and he took the full discharge. A pause. They recovered his body, or most of it. A reliquary weapon. The enemy, the covenant of the unbroken wheel. They use sanctified arms, blessed ordnance. They believe their God authorizes the war, so the war becomes an act of worship. So the weapons become instruments of devotion. Saul's voice carried the specific flatness of a man reciting a doctrine he has examined from every angle and still cannot find comfortable. It complicates our blessing wards. Their prayers and ours are, they interfere with each other. At close range, it becomes unpredictable. Yarrick filed this. Weapons that ran on faith. He had seen worse. He had seen weapons that ran on the screaming of the dying, on the joy of murder, on the vast biological rage of a species that had never once in its entire evolutionary history considered the possibility of peace. Faith weapons were at least symmetrical. You could work with symmetrical. Your God, Yarrick said. Tell me the name. Saul's expression shifted into something more complex. The God Crusader, the eternal militant. On he who marches at the head of the righteous. He paused. You don't know him. I know a great many things that march at the head of armies and claim righteousness. I reserve judgment on most of them. Yarrick moved to the camp stool in the corner and sat, the power claw resting across his knee, the bale eye dimming slightly in what a man who knew him might have read as deliberate restraint. I was a servant of the imperium of man. I fought in his name, in the name of an emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years, and who may or may not have ever been what we believed him to be. And I held that line anyway, because the line needed holding regardless of the theology. I am telling you this so you understand where I stand before your men outside have finished constructing whatever story they are constructing about me. They're calling you a saint, Saul said quietly. I know. Are you? The bale eye found him. Saul did not step back, which Yarrick noted with approval. I am a commissar, Yarrick said. I hold lines. I shoot men who run. I make the space between the enemy and the people behind me as expensive as possible for anyone who tries to cross it. Whether that makes me holy is a question for your theologians, and I have no interest in their answer. He stood. What I am interested in is your reserve section, your maps of the covenant's supply approaches, and whether you have anything resembling a working box unit in this trench that hasn't been ruined by the damp. A beat. The water. Saul stared at him for another moment. Then he turned and called for his adjutant. Outside, Yarrick could hear the murmuring, the word moving through the trench like warmth. He had felt it before. Not saint, never saint, but something adjacent. The specific reverence men develop for a figure who does not appear to fear the thing they fear most. He had spent a career making tactical use of it, and an equal number of years being quietly, privately appalled by it. He was appalled now. He drank the water Saul's adjutant brought him and looked at the map and began the particular work of understanding a war he had not been invited to. They gave him a guide for the trench walk. A corporal named Vas Dreyer, 19 years old with the eyes of a man twice that, one who had been assigned the task with the specific energy of someone who has been told to do an honor and is terrified of doing it wrong. He walked 2 paces behind Yarrick and did not speak unless spoken to, which meant he did not speak at all for the first 20 minutes because Yarrick was not speaking. He was looking, and looking was the whole point. The lateral trench of Section 9 ran for approximately 800 meters before it kinked northeast toward the communication trenches feeding the St. Ambrose salient. It was a mature trench, which meant it had been here long enough to develop personality. The walls were revetted in places with timber, in others with sandbags that had slowly become part of the mud around them, indistinguishable except by the regularity of their shape. Fire steps had been carved at intervals. Drainage sumps had been dug and had mostly failed. The floor was a sequence of duckboard sections, some intact, some long since rotted through, and navigating it required a specific rhythm that Dreyer had mastered and Yarrick acquired within the first 100 meters. Men watched him pass. They did not crowd him. There was a quality to their watching that was different from curiosity. It had the stillness of something devotional, The particular posture of men in the presence of an icon. They touched their weapons when he passed, or their crucifixes, or both. One man pressed two fingers briefly to his forehead in what appeared to be a formal gesture of acknowledgement. Another simply stared with his mouth slightly open and his hands loose at his sides. The way men stand when they have stopped thinking and started feeling. Yes, Yarrick did not acknowledge any of it. He looked at the trench. What he saw was competent misery administered by people who knew what they were doing and had long since stopped expecting it to end. The fire steps were properly positioned. The sentry posts were staggered so that no single point of catastrophic failure would blind the entire section. The wire arrangements ahead of the parapet, visible in glimpses through the firing slits, were irregular and overlapping. Not elegant, but practical. The kind of obstacle array that had been augmented piecemeal over months rather than planned in a single night. Someone in this section had known their business once and had trained the people around them before dying or being transferred. The gaps were visible too. 3 sections of revetment that had partially collapsed and been shored up with material that would not last another hard winter. A drainage sump so full it had begun to back up along the trench line, creating a 30-meter stretch of ankle-deep standing water that would rot boots and breed infection with equal efficiency. A stretch of fire step that had been raised incorrectly, too high by perhaps 8 centimeters, enough to expose the crown of a standing man's helmet above the parapet at certain angles. Yarrick stopped at the fire step and looked at it for a moment. "Who built this section?" Dreyer checked himself. "3rd Platoon, sir. Corporal Hannock's section. He died at the Bitter Crossing. Find whoever is responsible for it now and have it corrected before nightfall." 8 centimeters. "Oh, a sniper with patience has already noted it." He moved on. "What is the enemy's standard engagement distance on this front?" "The Covenant holds positions approximately 240 meters from our wire on average, sir. Closer in the salient, the St. Ambrose approach is narrow to perhaps 90 meters at the closest point." Dreyer paused. "Their snipers they're a problem, sir. They use blessed rounds. The rounds don't just wound. The men they hit, they don't always. It's not only the physical damage, sir." Yarrick looked at him sideways. "Explain." Dreyer struggled with it for a moment. "Men struck by Covenant-blessed rounds sometimes lose their faith, sir. Not all of them, but some. They wake up from the wound and they can't pray anymore. They say the words, but they don't feel them. And in this war, in this trench, faith is it's not a luxury, sir. The blessing wards need—" He stopped. "The defensive works require active belief to function," Yarrick said flatly. "Yes, sir." Yarrick absorbed this without expression. In the Imperium, faith had been the fuel of the Adeptus Sororitas, the engine of the ecclesiarchy. The thing that made men stand when standing made no material sense. He had never been sentimental about it. He had never needed to be. Faith was a resource like ammunition. You managed it, you conserved it, you kept it away from things that would deplete it, and you did not waste it on questions that wouldn't help you hold the line. That it was also apparently a direct mechanical requirement for the physical integrity of the defensive works. Here was simply a new logistical variable. He filed it under complications and kept walking. The trench kinked northeast and the character of it changed. The men here were quieter. Not the quiet of discipline, the quiet of proximity, of a section of line close enough to the enemy that sound itself became tactical. The artillery was louder here. The St. Ambrose shelling rolling across the gray sky in overlapping concussions that you felt in the sternum more than heard. The mud on the walls had a different smell, sharper, more recently disturbed, with an undertone that Yarrick recognized after a moment as incense. Not the acrid promethium smoke of the ecclesiarchy's censers, something cleaner and older, something that made the air in the throat feel briefly sanctified. He stopped at a firing slit and looked through. No man's land in the Veldenmarch was not appreciably different from no man's land anywhere. The same grammar of devastation, the same cratered moonscape, the same forests of wire reduced to rusted calligraphy, the same suggestion of shapes in the middle distance that might be debris or might be men who had not been recovered. The sky above it was the specific pewter of a sky that had forgotten any other color. But there was something in the middle distance that was not debris. A structure, a tower perhaps, or the remains of one. It was difficult to judge scale at this distance. Rising from the churned earth at an angle that suggested it had been damaged but not destroyed. Something hung from it, a banner or a reliquary. At this distance he could not read it, but the bale eye adjusted automatically, the red aperture narrowing, bringing the far object into sharper resolution. A wheel, an iron wheel, vast and devotional, hung from the damaged tower like a sun. The covenant of the unbroken wheel. Yarrick looked at it for a long time. He had faced orcs who believed their own mythology so completely that the belief became a physical force in the material world. He had fought in wars where faith was not metaphor, but mechanism, where the line between prayer and weapon had been a matter of semantics at best. He understood fanaticism. He had spent his career in its shadow. He had even, in his most private moments, understood its appeal. The absolute clarity of it, the way it simplified every impossible question into a single answerable one. He understood it. He had never trusted it. He turned from the slit and continued walking. And behind him Dreyer touched his own small iron crucifix and said nothing. And the trench breathed around them in the gray pre-noon light, like something alive and exhausted and unwilling to die. The prisoner was brought in just after midday. He had been taken in a trench raid 3 days prior and had been held in the Section 9 detention dugout, a low earthen room with a single lamp and a door that didn't quite fit its frame, while Captain Sol decided what to do with him. The problem, Sol explained to Yarrick with the specific diplomatic care of a man navigating a subject he found personally uncomfortable, was that Covenant prisoners were not straightforward. They did not break under conventional interrogation. Not because they were trained to resist, though some were, but because they genuinely did not experience the process the way other men did. They prayed through it. They sang through it. They looked at their interrogators with an expression of such complete and untroubled certainty that the interrogators frequently emerged from the sessions more disturbed than the prisoner. They believe they're already dead, Sol said. Sanctified dead. Every moment past their enlistment is borrowed time given back to the god Crusader. You can't threaten a man with something he's already surrendered. You can, Yarrick said. You're threatening the wrong things. Sol looked at him. Sir, take me to him. The prisoner was perhaps 35, with a broad, honest face that had been arranged by his injuries into something asymmetric. A poorly set cheekbone, a healing split across the bridge of his nose, the yellowish residue of bruising around both eyes. He was sitting against the earthen wall with his knees drawn up and his hands loose in his lap, and he was not praying aloud, which Sol had apparently found more unsettling than if he had been. He wore the Covenant's field uniform, gray-white with the iron wheel emblem at the collar, and it had been stripped of insignia during processing. He looked up when Yarrick entered, and his expression did not change. Yarrick sat on the single camp stool and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The bale eye was dimmed to its lowest register, in which still filled the small room with enough red light to make shadows move strangely. The prisoner watched it with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite devotion. A middle state, the expression of a man filing information away for later theological consideration. You've been asked about troop dispositions, Yarrick said. Force strengths, supply lines, rotation schedules. The prisoner said nothing. I'm not going to ask you those things. Yarrick leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, the power claw resting between his boots with a sound like a tool set down between tasks. I'm going to ask you about your God. Something moved in the prisoner's face. The smallest recalibration. Not alarm, but attention. The shift of a man who has been waiting for a particular question. The god Crusader, Yarrick said. Ari, tell me what he wants. The prisoner's chin came up slightly. Victory, he said. His voice was accented. Not Veldenmarch. Something from further south or east. The consonants harder. Purification of the line. The heretics behind their wire hold ground that was promised. The wheel turns and grinds them from the earth they have no right to stand on. Promised by whom? By revelation, by the signs given to the first Crusaders at the founding march, by the testimony of the saints who walked before us. Your saints tell you to fight. Our saints are fighters. The prisoner's voice carried the specific warmth of a man discussing something he loves. They did not ascend in peace. They ascended mid-stride, weapon in hand, still advancing. That is the nature of sanctity in the God Crusader's sight. Not stillness, not contemplation. Not emotion. Forward motion. Always forward. Yarrick was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about a conversation he had never had with an orc war boss, had never been able to have, the cognitive gap too vast, but had spent 50 years trying to understand from the outside. The orcs fought because fighting was the point. The purpose was the violence, and the violence was the theology, and the theology was the violence. A closed loop of such perfect self-referential logic that you could not find the seam to insert doubt. The Covenant were not orcs. They were something more dangerous in a specific way. They had the same closed loop, but they had wrapped it in language, in imagery, in a framework of meaning that could reach across the gap between one human soul and another and plant itself there and grow. Your God walks at the head of the advance, Yarrick said. Does he carry a weapon? A sword, the prisoner said immediately, and a banner. The banner shows the wheel, the eternal turning, the grinding of the unrighteous, the forward momentum that cannot be stopped. He does not look back. He never looks back. To look back is to doubt, and doubt is... He stopped. His eyes moved to Yarrick's coat, the insignia, the power claw, the bale eye, and something passed through his expression that was complex enough to be worth reading. Ask it, Yarrick said. The prisoner took a breath. The men outside say you came out of the earth, that you were dead and came back. He paused. Did the God Crusader send you? The question sat in the small room like something with weight. Yarrick felt it the way you feel a tripwire with your boot. Carefully, without moving, he said, I was sent by nothing and no one. I came back because I wasn't finished. That is the only resurrection I have ever understood. The prisoner stared at him. Something was working behind his eyes. The machinery of a faith encountering a fact that didn't fit its categories, grinding at the edges of it, trying to find accommodation. Your forward positions, Yarrick said, his voice dropping to the register he used when the courtesy was over. The tower in no man's land, the reliquary wheel. What is it? The prisoner's jaw closed. The warmth went out of his expression, replaced by the flat certainty Sol had described. The face of a man who has given what he will give and found the boundary. Yarrick stood. He looked down at the prisoner for a moment with the bale eye at full register. When the red light filling the man's face and the prisoner did not flinch, which Yarrick noted without pleasure. You believe in your God, Yarrick said. That is not a weakness. Belief that holds under pressure is the most load-bearing material available in any war. He moved toward the door. But the wheel turns on everyone eventually. Remember that. He left the prisoner in the red-lit dark and stood in the trench outside and breathed the cold Velden March air and thought about closed loops and forward momentum and all the ways a righteous war could eat the men who fought it without ever pausing to apologize. The artillery to the northeast had not stopped. It had been getting closer for the last hour. The demand came in writing, which Yarrick found professionally insulting. A runner arrived from the rear echelon at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, a boy of perhaps 16 in a coat too large for him, carrying a sealed document with the wax impression of a wheel pressed into it with more force than was strictly necessary for correspondence. The runner delivered it to Captain Sol, who read it, set it down, picked it up again, and then walked it to Yarrick in the manner of a man delivering something he would have preferred not to touch. The document was formal, ornate even. The letterhead carried illuminated marginalia, small devotional scenes rendered in careful ink. Crusaders in mid-advance with their faces raised toward a light source positioned just above the top of the page. The language was the language of ecclesiastical authority, which Yarrick had encountered in 100 different forms across 100 different worlds and which always said the same essential thing beneath its decorative variations. We have power here, and we are reminding you of it. The content was simple. Marshal Antonin Korvath, commanding the Crusade of the Bleeding Stave, required the attendance of the individual described as the returned Commissar at the Crusade command post at Veldenmarch rear by the following morning. The individual was further required to present himself for theological examination by the order of the Stave's appointed examiners. He was further required, and this was the sentence Yarrick read twice, to formally receive the blessing of the god Crusader's right of incorporation, even by which act he would be recognized as a sanctified instrument of the crusade and accorded appropriate status within its hierarchy. At the bottom, in a different hand, smaller and more personal, the men speak of miracles. Miracles belong to the god Crusader. All instruments of his will must be properly consecrated. This is not negotiable. Yarrick set the document on Sol's map table. How far is the rear command post? 6 kilometers back along the Holt Road, sir. Through territory currently under artillery interdiction from the Covenant's northeastern battery. Sol cleared his throat. The timing is, yes, the Marshal's runner came through during a lull. The lull has ended. Yarrick could hear it. The rolling concussions to the northeast had shifted slightly in the last 20 minutes. A change in the pattern that suggested the Covenant's battery had adjusted its registration. The shells were walking southwest along the Holt Road with the methodical patience of good artillerists finding their range. Going to the rear command post tonight would mean 6 kilometers of road under active adjustment fire, which was possible but wasteful of luck he might need later. More to the point, he looked at the document again, at the sentence about consecration and incorporation. He had been in this trench for less than 12 hours, and already the ecclesiastical machinery was reaching for him. He recognized the motion. He had seen it performed by the missionarius Galaxia, one by confessors who had decided a popular commissar needed to be formally absorbed into the ecclesiarchy's narrative before the rank and file drew their own conclusions. It was not malicious necessarily, it was institutional. Large organizations containing sincere believers developed an automatic immune response to unattributed miracles. They could not leave them free-floating, undefined, outside the taxonomy. A man who rose from the dead either belonged to the god Crusader or he was something else, something that needed examining in a different and less comfortable way. Yarrick had never belonged to anything that tried to claim him after the fact. "Draft a reply," he said to Sol. Sol reached for his pen with visible uncertainty. "Sir, the Marshal, draft a reply." Yarrick's voice did not rise. It never needed to. "Write that Commissar Yarrick thanks the Marshal for his communication and will present himself at the rear command post at the earliest operationally viable opportunity. Write that current assessment of the St. Ambrose salient suggests that opportunity will not arise before the present threat to the northeastern front has been stabilized. Write that in the interim, Commissar Yarrick respectfully declines to leave the line." He paused. "Then add one more line." Sol's pen hovered. "Sir, write, the god Crusader's instruments do not require consecration. They require ammunition." Sol stared at the paper. He wrote it. His face during the writing had the expression of a man signing something he knows will have consequences, doing it anyway because the alternative is explaining to the man standing next to him why he didn't. And the runner was sent back into the lull that had not quite fully ended, the sealed reply tucked inside his oversized coat, and Yarrick returned to the map. The problem of the St. Ambrose salient was becoming urgent in the specific way of tactical problems that have been allowed to develop past the point of elegant solution. There were no good options remaining, only options of varying cost. The Covenant's artillery had been working on the salient's northeastern corner for 18 hours. The blessing wards on that section of parapet, according to the section Corporal Yarrick had spoken to an hour prior, were degrading. Not failing, degrading, which was in some ways worse, because degrading defensive works created false confidence, men trusting protection that was offering them 30% less than they believed. And beneath all of this was the thing Yarrick had not said aloud yet, the thing that had been assembling itself from fragments since the prisoner interview, and the walk, and the way the artillery pattern had shifted. The Covenant knew the blessing wards were degrading. The adjusted battery registration, the sustained pressure on the northeast corner specifically, this was not random bombardment. Someone on the other side of that wire understood the mechanics of faith-based defensive works well enough to attack their psychological substrate rather than their physical structure. Keep the men under sustained pressure, erode their confidence, let doubt do what shells cannot. Then advance into a line that was physically intact but spiritually hollow. It was, Yarrick thought with the specific appreciation of a professional for competent opposition. Quite good. He put his metal finger on the map at the point where the mill structure channeled the approach. I need 6 men who have not been under direct fire in the last 48 hours, he said. Not because they are rested, because they still believe the ward's work. Saul looked up from the reply he was still blotting dry. Sir? Faith is load-bearing material, Yarrick said. I told you that. I need men whose load-bearing capacity is intact. He looked at Saul directly. And I need to know if your God Crusader has ever actually appeared to anyone in this army. Not in vision, not in dream, in person, physically present. Has anyone in this crusade ever stood in front of him? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. So Saul set down the blotting paper very carefully. That is a significant question, sir. Most of the important ones are, Yarrick said, and turned back to the map. The tribunal convened at the 6th hour, which meant it convened in the dark. This was not planned. The marshal's second communication had arrived 2 hours after the first, shorter and considerably less decorated, informing Captain Saul that given the Commissar's refusal to present himself at the rear command post, a panel of the Order of the Stave's theological examiners would instead present themselves at Section 9. They arrived as the last gray light was bleeding out of the Velden March sky. 4 men in white surplices worn over field coats, picking their way along the trench with the careful dignity of men determined not to let their vestments touch the mud. They were led by a thin, precise figure who introduced himself as Examiner Primus Cale Rother, and who had the specific quality of stillness that Yarrick associated with men who had decided long ago that certainty was more valuable than accuracy. Saul had cleared the command dugout for the occasion, sending his adjutant and maps out into the trench and replacing them with the examiner's portable altar, a folding construction of dark wood with the iron wheel at its center, and 4 additional candles that made the small space considerably warmer and considerably more theatrical. Yarrick sat on his camp stool. The examiners arranged themselves opposite, and Rother stood at the altar with a leather-bound codex open before him and looked at Yarrick with the expression of a man who has performed this function many times and expects a predictable outcome. This proceeding, Rother said, is convened to determine the nature and origin of the individual known as the returned Commissar, with specific attention to whether his return from death represents a genuine instrument of the God Crusader's will, a manifestation of enemy theological interference, or a phenomenon of ambiguous origin requiring containment pending further examination. He paused. The individual is invited to assist the panel in reaching its determination. The individual, Yarrick said, notes that he has been in this trench for less than a day and has already identified 3 structural deficiencies in the defensive line that will cost you men before the week is out if unaddressed. You may wish to factor the cost of this tribunal into your operational accounting. Rother's expression did not change. The panel will begin with the question of origin. By what mechanism did you return from death? I don't know. You don't? Rother paused. You are claiming ignorance of your own resurrection? I am claiming accurate reporting. I died. I woke up in your mud. The intervening process was not available for my observation. Yarrick met his gaze flatly. If you have a theological framework that accounts for this more precisely than I can, I am willing to hear it. I am not willing to confirm a framework I cannot verify simply because it would be convenient for your taxonomy. One of the other examiners, younger, with the unguarded face of a man whose certainty was newer and therefore more brittle, leaned forward. You deny that the God Crusader sent you? I deny knowledge of it. Those are different statements. If the God Crusader did not send you, then something else brought you here. Something with the power to move men across the boundary of death. The young examiner's voice carried a specific urgency. In our theology, only 2 forces possess that power: the God Crusader and his enemy. Name the enemy. A silence. The candles moved in a draft from the badly fitted door. The unmade, Rother said carefully, the force that opposes the crusade, that seeks to stop the wheels turning. It manifests in many forms: despair, doubt, corruption of faith, the hollowing of belief from within. He paused. It has been known to manufacture false saints. Has it? Yarrick's voice was without inflection. The panel must consider the possibility that you are such a manufacturer. Yarrick looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood, and the movement in the confined space had the quality of something large adjusting its position. Not aggressive, but impossible to ignore. The power claw catching the candlelight and throwing it in fragments across the wooden altar and the iron wheel and Rother's careful face. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice. I have been a commissar of the Imperium of Man for 50 years, he said. And in that time I have held the line at Hades' Hive against an orc invasion that should have ended a world. I have been captured, tortured, and released because my enemy decided my death was not worth the propaganda cost. I have watched empires rot from their theology outward, watched men with absolute faith in absolute truth commit absolute atrocities because their certainty made the arithmetic of suffering invisible to them. He let that sit for a moment. I am not a false saint. I am not a true saint. I am a commissar, which means I am the thing that stands between the men behind me and everything that wants them dead, and I perform that function regardless of whether the local theological framework has a category for me. He looked at each of the examiners in turn, finishing with Rother. Your wards are degrading on the northeast corner of the St. Ambrose salient. The Covenant's artillery has been walking that section specifically for 18 hours, because someone on their side understands that doubt is more structurally damaging than shells. Your men in that section are losing faith not because they are weak, but because they have been under sustained assault specifically designed to produce that result. That is your emergency, not me. Rother was quiet for a long moment. His codex was still open, but he had stopped looking at it. The panel, he said finally carefully, has not reached a determination. Then the panel should reach one quickly, Yarrick said, or step aside and let me work. You cannot do both simultaneously. He moved toward the door. I will be on the fire step if I am needed. I suggest you decide what I am before morning, because morning is when the Covenant will test your northeast corner, and whatever I am, I intend to be standing on the right side of the wire when they do. He pushed through the door and into the cold dark of the trench. Behind him, he heard Rother say something in a low voice to the other examiners. He did not hear the words. He did not need to. He had stood before enough tribunals, inquisitorial, ecclesiastical, military, to know the sound of institutional uncertainty meeting an immovable object and beginning, reluctantly, to root around it. The trench was quiet. The artillery had paused in that specific way that experienced soldiers recognize not as silence but as breath. The inhalation before the next sequence. Men stood at the fire steps in the dark, faces turned northeast, aim waiting. Dreyer materialized at Yarrick's elbow. Sir, the 6 men you asked for are assembled at the northeast kink. Good. Yarrick looked up at the sky, at the pewter dark of it, at the absence of stars behind the cloud cover. Somewhere out there the Covenant's reliquary wheel hung from its damaged tower, patient and devotional, grinding through its rotation. Tell them what they're going to do. What are they going to do, sir? They're going to pray, Yarrick said, loudly, on the fire step, in full view of the parapet. Dreyer processed this. Sir, that will make them visible, yes. Make them targets, yes. He began walking toward the northeast king. But it will also demonstrate to every man in this section that someone believes the wards still work. Belief is contagious. So is doubt. He paused without turning. Which do you want spreading through this trench tonight? Dreyer did not answer. He went to find the 6 men. The advance came at the 3rd hour past midnight, not at dawn, which was when advances were supposed to come, when the light was ambiguous enough to confuse defenders and the night's cold had stiffened fingers and slowed response times. The Covenant came at the 3rd hour because the 3rd hour was the hour of the God Crusaders' founding revelation, when the first Crusaders had risen from their camp in the absolute dark and begun their march without waiting for morning, and because the symbolism was operationally useful. Men who believed they were enacting a sacred moment fought with a quality that men fighting merely for survival could not easily match. Yarrick heard them before the sentries called it, where he had been on the fire step for 2 hours, standing in the cold with the 6 men Dreyer had assembled, not praying. He had been clear about that. He was not going to pray, but he was going to stand where the praying men could be seen standing. And the quality of the silence in the last 10 minutes had changed in a way that his body recognized before his mind articulated it. A particular density, the specific held breath quality of several hundred men trying to move quietly across open ground and not quite succeeding, the collective suppression of sound creating its own kind of noise for someone who knew what to listen for. He was already off the fire step and moving along the trench when the first sentry called contact. What followed was not a battle in the formal sense. It was a rout attempting to become a defense. And the difference between those two outcomes was approximately 40 meters of trench and the time it took Yarrick to cover it. The northeast corner of the St. Ambrose salient had 3 sections. The first held, the second held because the first held. The men in it heard the resistance ahead of them and found something to stand on. The third section was where the wards had degraded furthest, where the sustained artillery had done its psychological work most thoroughly, and it was the third section that broke first. Not catastrophically, not in a rout, but in the specific incremental way of men who have been told by every sensory input available to them that the position is untenable and who have begun, individually and then collectively, to believe it. They were pulling back from the fire step when Yarrick arrived. He did not shoot anyone. He had that option, and he assessed it in the half-second between arriving and acting, and he set it aside. These were not cowards. They were men whose faith-based defensive infrastructure had been systematically dismantled over 18 hours, and who were responding rationally to the information available to them. Shooting them would stop the immediate movement, but it would not rebuild what had been taken from them, and what this section needed in the next 90 seconds was not fear of him, but something to stand behind. So he stepped past them, onto the fire step, and looked over the parapet. The Covenant came out of the dark in waves. Not the screaming charge of the orc. Nothing so biologically honest as that. But something more considered, more terrible in its own way. Men walking forward in close order, some singing. The hymn was low and rhythmic, and it moved with them across no man's land the way weather moves, the way a front moves, inexorable and indifferent to the obstacles in its path. They carried the iron wheel on poles above the first rank, several of them, the cymbals catching what little light existed and throwing it back in cold fragments. Their weapons were raised. Their faces, where Yarrick could see them in the Bale Eye's red-lit resolution, were arranged in expressions of absolute peace. He had seen that expression before, on the faces of orc war bosses mid-charge, on the faces of Chaos Space Marines mid-ritual, on the faces of men who had found the specific state of being in which the self had been surrendered entirely to something larger, and who were, in that surrender, briefly invulnerable to anything that operated on the level of the self. Briefly. "Hold the step," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need loudness here. He needed the specific register that cuts through noise, not by volume, but by certainty. The voice that the hindbrain recognizes as the voice of someone who knows what is happening and has decided what to do about it. The men who had been pulling back stopped. Not all of them. Enough. He picked up the nearest man's rifle, a bolt action, heavier than he was used to, with a blessing seal pressed into the stock that warmed faintly under his palm, and fired twice into the advancing line. Not at the wheelbearers. At the men behind the first rank, at the second rank where the momentum of the advance was generated, where the mass of bodies was pushing the front rank forward. 2 shots. Yarrick, 2 men went down. The advance stuttered. In the stutter, the men beside him fired. The Bale Eye swept the parapet. The red light was visible from outside the wire. He knew this. He was using it. The specific signal value of something inhuman and patient watching from the dark. Something that did not flinch at the advance. Something that had apparently returned from death and found the prospect insufficient reason for alarm. He had spent 50 years understanding how orcs processed him, had understood that his survival was itself a weapon, that the stories Gazgakul's warriors told about the human who would not die had tactical value beyond anything his last pistol could achieve. He did not know yet what the Covenant made of him. He intended to find out by providing them with data. The advance reached the wire. The wire held, physical wire held regardless of the faith of the men behind it, which was one advantage of material defensive works over metaphysical ones, and the first rank compressed against it, the singing fragmenting as the operational reality of tangled wire and close-range fire interrupted the liturgical rhythm. The second rank pushed into the first, the third rank pushed into the second. The advance became a crowd, became a target. Yarrick set down the borrowed rifle. He turned to the man beside him, a corporal, 30 or so, with the shaking hands of sustained adrenaline and the straight back of a man refusing to let the shaking be visible. Your name? Corporal Annex, sir. Annex. Your wards are intact on this section. Do you understand me? Intact. He held the man's eyes with the brown one, keeping the bale eye dim. When I stood on this fire step for 2 hours, nothing came through. Not because I am a saint, because the wards were holding and the men maintaining them were doing their function. That is the truth of what happened here tonight. Annex stared at him. Yarrick watched the information travel from the man's ears to somewhere deeper, watched it find purchase in the load-bearing structure of his belief and settle there. Yes, sir, Annex said. Good. Yarrick turned back to the parapet. Tell the men beside you. The Covenant pulled back from the wire at the 4th hour, carrying their dead with them in the deliberate way of forces that do not intend to leave anything behind that can be used as evidence of loss. The hymn resumed as they withdrew, rebuilt itself from fragments into something coherent, and then into something almost defiant, a rearguard of sound covering the physical rearguard. Yarrick stood on the fire step and watched them go. Behind him, the trench was finding its breath again, the specific exhalation of men who had been close to breaking and hadn't, who were now standing in the complicated private space of that discovery, not yet certain what it meant about them, whether they should be proud or simply relieved, or some mixture of both that didn't have a word yet. Dreyer appeared at his shoulder. Sir, we held. Yes. The men are saying... He stopped. I know what they're saying. Yarrick stepped down from the fire step. His knee was bad. It had been bad for 20 years, a souvenir of Armageddon that the augmetics had improved but not resolved. And the step down sent a familiar complaint through the joint that he noted and ignored. How many casualties? 7 dead, sir. 14 wounded, 4 seriously. Yarrick absorbed this. 7 names he didn't have yet. He would get them. He always got them. The Northeast Ward, he said. Are they holding? Dreher hesitated. The men believe they are, sir. Then they are, Yarrick said, and walked back toward the command dugout through the dark and the cold and the smell of cordite and old faith and mud that still remembered trying to keep him. Dawn came to the Veldenmarch the way it always came, reluctantly as though the sky had considered the matter and found insufficient reason for optimism, but proceeded anyway out of mechanical obligation. The light was flat and gray, and it revealed the no-man's land between the wire and the same state it always occupied. Churned, scarred, indifferent to what had happened across it in the dark. The Covenant's dead had been recovered. The wire was intact. The salient held. Yarrick sat in the command dugout with 7 names written on a piece of paper. He had gotten them from Dreyer an hour before dawn. Full names, not just surnames, because surnames were how armies processed men, and full names were how men processed themselves, and the distinction mattered to Yarrick in a way he had never been able to fully articulate and had long since stopped trying to. He looked at the list. He did not pray over it. He did not perform any ritual with it. He simply looked at it long enough that the names became specific rather than aggregate, became 7 particular men rather than a number in an operational accounting. And then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat where it would stay until he found somewhere appropriate to leave it. Sol arrived at 1/2 the first hour with 2 cups of something hot that was nominally tea and a face carrying the specific arrangement of a man who has news he has been rehearsing how to deliver. Yarrick took the tea. The Marshal, Sol sat down. A dispatch arrived an hour ago. The Marshal has... He has formally convened a full ecclesiastical inquiry, not a panel. A full inquiry with authority to... The language is... He pulled out the document. Authority to determine the theological status of the returned Commissar and to prescribe appropriate measures pending that determination, up to and including custody pending examination. Custody, Yarrick said. Yes, sir. He wants to remove me from the line. The inquiry has the authority to... I understand what the inquiry has authority to do. Yarrick drank the tea. It was bad tea, the kind produced by leaves that had been used at least once before and dried out and used again. But it was hot and it was honest, and he appreciated both qualities. Rother. Examiner Primus Rother has been appointed to lead the inquiry. Yes. Saul paused. Sir, I want to be clear that I have not facilitated this. The Marshal has his own intelligence network, and the runner I sent last night was apparently not the only communication that left this section. Someone reported last night's engagement. In specific terms, yes. And with them, the detail about the bail eye being visible from outside the wire seems to have been... It generated concern at the rear echelon. Saul set down his cup. Sir, the men who were on that fire step last night, they are not describing what happened in operational terms. They are describing it as a miracle. The word has moved faster than the runner. Yarrick set down his own cup. He understood the mechanics of what was happening with the cold clarity of a man who had seen institutional machinery engage before and knew the sound of its gears. The Marshal was not necessarily a cynical man. Probably wasn't, in fact. Probably believed sincerely in the God Crusader and in the theological framework that the crusade operated within. And within that framework, an unincorporated miracle was a genuine problem. A miracle that belonged to the crusade was a resource. A miracle that didn't belong to anyone was a threat. It created unauthorized narrative, unauthorized hope, hope that pointed somewhere other than the official theology, which was the most destabilizing force available in a faith-based military organization. The Marshal was not trying to destroy him. The Marshal was trying to capture him, which was in some ways more difficult to resist. How long before Rother arrives? Yarrick said. The dispatch said, Saul checked. By the second hour. Yarrick looked at the map. The St. Ambrose salient was quiet this morning, the Covenant regrouping after last night's rebuff. But the pattern he had been reading since his trench walk suggested that last night was a probe. An expensive probe, admittedly, but a probe nonetheless, designed to test the response capacity of the section and identify the specific human variables that had reinforced the northeast corner. They had found those variables. They would adjust. The next advance would come at a different point, or at the same point with different force composition, or with additional reliquary weapons targeted specifically at the faith infrastructure he had inadvertently demonstrated was functional. He had perhaps 4 hours before the next serious pressure. Rother would arrive in 2. He stood and took his coat from the hook behind the door and put it on. Where are you going, sir? Saul asked. To speak to the men. He spent the next hour walking the line, not the inspection walk of the previous day. This was different in character, slower, with stops. He stood at each fire step where men were posted and looked at them and asked their names and listened to the answers and said something specific to each man. Not encouragement in the abstract, not the liturgical affirmation of their faith or their bravery, but something particular, something that required having observed them. He told Annex that his fire discipline on the northeast fire step had been correct, and that the men beside him had matched it because he had. He told a private named Voss that the drainage sum he had apparently been requesting cleared for 2 weeks needed to be cleared today, and that Yarrick would be speaking to Captain Sull about it personally. He told an old sergeant named Ferrick, who had fought in 3 previous campaigns and wore his experience like armor, was that the section rotation schedule had a gap in it on the western approach that Ferrick had probably already noticed, and that Yarrick was interested in his solution. He did not perform holiness. He performed attention. The men watched him the way they had watched him yesterday, with the devotional stillness. But something in the quality of it was changing. The pure veneration of the first hours, the icon response, the instinctive prostration before the returned dead, was acquiring texture, complexity, a second layer beneath the faith. He could see it in their faces when he said their names, the surprise of being specifically known, the subtle recalibration that occurred when a figure of legend demonstrated awareness of the drainage sump. This was the more dangerous reverence in his experience. Wewun, the icon worship burned hot and brief, and men recovered from it. The second kind, the kind that came from being seen, that kind lasted. That kind changed how men stood and what they stood for and what they were willing to do on a fire step at the third hour past midnight when the alternatives were all worse. He was completing the western section when Dreyer found him. Examiner Primus Rother, sir. He's arrived early. He's in the command dugout and… Dreyer paused in a way that communicated information without words. And he's not alone. He has 6 of the Marshal's guard with him, sir. Armed. Yarrick turned and looked east along the trench line toward the command dugout. Then he looked west toward the Covenant wire. Then he looked at Dreyer, who was doing his best to maintain a professional expression over something that was plainly and sincerely frightened. Dreyer, Yarrick said, sir, when I came up out of that mud yesterday morning, what did you think I was? Dreyer's professional expression dropped entirely. He was 19 years old and he had been in the Velden March for 14 months, and he answered with the specific honesty of someone who has stopped having the energy for anything else. I thought you were the answer to something, sir. I didn't know what the question was. Yarrick looked at him for a moment. The question is whether the men in this trench hold the line without someone telling them God wants them to. He paused. Go back to the command dugout. Tell Rother I am coming. He began walking east. Behind him, from somewhere along the western section, he heard a man quietly resume the hymn the Covenant had carried across the wire the night before. Not the enemy's words, but the melody, stripped of its original meaning and occupied by something new. The way soldiers had always taken the music of survival and made it briefly, stubbornly, their own. He did not look back. Rother had brought the altar. It was set up in the command dugout with the precision of a man who understood that environment was argument. The folding dark wood, the iron wheel centered and level, the 6 candles arranged in the specific geometry of formal ecclesiastical proceeding, rather than the improvised 4 of the previous night. The 6 Marshal's guards stood at ease along the dugout walls, which reduced the available space considerably and was presumably the point. Sol was present but had been relocated to the corner furthest from the door, the spatial equivalent of being told to wait outside. Rother stood at the altar with his codex closed this time, which was more unsettling than when it had been open. An open codex meant he was working from authority. A closed one meant he had already decided. Yarrick entered and took the camp stool and sat. Examiner Primus, he said. Commissar. Rother's voice was precisely calibrated. Not hostile, not warm, the specific neutrality of a man who had learned the tone was information and was withholding it. The inquiry has met through the night. We have considered the testimony of Captain Sol, Corporal Dreyer, Corporal Annex, and 6 additional witnesses to the events of the past 20 hours. Efficient. The God Crusader's work does not benefit from delay. A pause. We have also considered the account of the engagement at the northeast salient, in particular the account of the Baelai's light and its effect on the Covenant's advance. Another pause, this one weighted differently. 3 men have independently testified that the Covenant's front rank stopped advancing at the moment the Baelai's light reached them. Not from fire, from the light itself. Yarrick said nothing. Is that account accurate? The Covenant's advance faltered at the wire due to a combination of physical obstacle, concentrated fire from the section, and the disruption of their hymn rhythm by close-range engagement. Whether my eye contributed to the faltering is not something I can assess from the fire step. I was busy. Rother looked at him with the expression of a man who has been given an answer that is technically complete and substantially evasive, and knows it. The inquiry's determination, he said, is that you represent a phenomenon of ambiguous origin that cannot currently be classified within the standard theological taxonomy of the God Crusader's instruments. I told you that yesterday. What I did not tell you yesterday, Rother continued with the deliberate patience of a man who has been building to something, is what the standard protocol requires in cases of ambiguous origin. He opened the codex, not to read from it, to show it the relevant passage marked with a strip of cloth. When ambiguous instruments are to be removed from active contact with the Crusade's personnel, pending full determination. The concern is contamination, not physical contamination, but theological. An unclassified phenomenon in proximity to men whose defensive capability relies on the integrity of their faith, represents an unacceptable risk of narrative disruption. Narrative disruption, Yarrick said, if the men begin to believe their protection comes from you rather than from the God Crusader, the faith substrate of the blessing wards shifts its foundation. The wards may continue to function temporarily on the residual faith already invested in them, but new investment will flow toward the wrong source and the long-term structural integrity is compromised, Yarrick finished. He looked at Rother with the brown eye, is keeping the bale eye dim. You're not wrong, Rother stopped. That is a genuine operational risk, and you have correctly identified it. Yarrick put his elbows on his knees. If the men in this trench begin to believe that their safety last night came from me rather than from their own faith in their own function, then you have a problem. Men who outsource their courage stop generating it internally. I have seen it. A commissar who fights the battle for his regiment produces men who cannot fight without a commissar. He paused, which is why I spent the last hour telling every man I spoke to that what held last night was their own discipline and their own belief, and that I was simply standing on the same fire step they were standing on. The dugout was very quiet. Rother stared at him. The guards along the walls were performing stillness with the concentration of men trying not to be noticed reacting to something. Rother closed the codex, opened it, closed it again. That is theologically sound, yes, Yarrick stood. I am not interested in being worshipped, Examiner Primus. I am interested in this trench holding. Those two interests are compatible if managed correctly and mutually destructive if they are not, and the management falls to both of us. He looked at Rother directly. I will not receive the right of incorporation. I will not be consecrated as a God Crusader instrument because I do not know if I am one, and I will not claim a provenance I cannot verify. But I will also not be removed from this line while the Covenant is preparing a second advance. Because removing me now would demonstrate to every man in this section that the institution they serve is more concerned with its own taxonomy than with their survival. And that demonstration will do more damage to their faith than anything I have said or done. He picked up his coat from the hook. The inquiry can continue. I have no objection to being examined. But the examination happens here, on the line, where I can still be useful while you determine what I am. Rother said nothing for a long moment. He was a precise man, and precise men, in Yarrick's experience, were capable of genuine recalibration when presented with logic that had no available counter. They didn't like it, but they were too honest with themselves to pretend the counter existed when it didn't. The Marshal will not accept this arrangement without conditions, Rother said finally. Name them. You will not perform any act that presents itself to the men as miraculous. You will not allow the Baal Eye to be used as a devotional symbol. You will not speak of your origin or your death in terms that suggest divine commission. He paused. And you will, at the earliest operationally viable opportunity, present yourself to the Marshal in person. Agreed, Yarrick said immediately, which clearly surprised Rother. Those are reasonable conditions, and I have no intention of violating them. I am not trying to build a religion, Examiner Primus. I have seen what religions do to wars. I am trying to hold a trench. He moved to the door and stopped. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way of the tribunal, wrong in the way of the body. To the specific animal alertness that had kept him alive for 50 years, the sensation of information arriving below the level of articulation. The artillery had stopped, not the gradual diminuendo of a battery standing down. The instantaneous cessation of a battery that has completed its preparatory task. He pushed through the door into the trench. The sky to the northeast was doing something unusual. Not shells, the artillery had stopped, but light. A cold, flat illumination that had no obvious source, rising from somewhere beyond the Covenant's wire in the direction of the damaged tower, the iron wheel hanging from its broken structure. And the light was white and it was spreading, and it carried in it a quality that Yarrick could not name precisely, but recognized the way you recognize a voice heard once in a circumstance of great stress. The quality of something that believed itself to be enormous, to be final, to be the last word in a very long argument. The blessing wards along the northeast parapet flared once, brilliantly, and went dark. not degraded. Dark, extinguished, as a candle is extinguished, cleanly and completely and all at once. In the sudden absence of the ward's faint luminescence, the trench felt different, flatter, colder, stripped of whatever quality the faith light had been adding to the air that you didn't notice until it was gone. The men on the fire steps turned from the parapet and looked at each other, and then looked at the northeast sky, and their faces in the bale eye's red light carried the expression of men who have just felt the floor shift beneath them. Yarrick was on the fire step before anyone else moved. He looked over the parapet. The tower in no man's land was standing differently. Not falling. It had been damaged. It had been standing at an angle for as long as he had been here. But the angle had changed, and the iron wheel was no longer hanging from the structure. It was turning. Slowly in the still air, with no wind to account for the motion, turning with the specific deliberateness of something that was not being moved by physics but was moving itself, and the cold white light was emanating from its hub, from the center of it, from the space within the wheel that was geometrically empty. It was not empty. Yarrick looked at the light with the brown eye and could not resolve what was in it. He looked at it with the bale eye, and the red aperture adjusted and narrowed and focused, and he saw for approximately 2 seconds something that he spent the rest of his time in the Veldenmarch not describing to anyone who asked. He had looked at things that claimed to be gods before. He had found them, without exception, to be less than they claimed and more than they should have been, and the combination had never once been sufficient reason to step off the fire step. He brought up the power claw. "Fix bayonets," he said. His voice carried the length of the trench in the absolute silence left by the extinguished wards and the stopped artillery. And he was aware of Ruther behind him, of Dreyer somewhere to his left, of Sol issuing orders he couldn't hear to the section behind him. He was aware of 200 men in various states of terror and faith, and the specific combination of both that was, in his experience, the most reliable foundation for what was about to be required of them. He was aware that his knee was bad. He looked at the light in the wheel. "Soldiers of the bleeding stave," he said, not loudly, into the silence. "The wards are down. The enemy is advancing. What you do in the next 10 minutes will determine what this section of the line means for every day of this war that comes after." He paused. "I have been in worse positions. I have held worse lines with worse men. And those lines held because the men holding them decided they would." He let that sit for the length of a breath. "Decide." The silence lasted exactly long enough. Then, from somewhere in the section behind him, he thought it was Annex, but he was never certain, a man began to pray aloud on the fire step, loudly, with the specific shameless volume of someone who has chosen their foundation and is prepared to stand on it regardless of who is watching. A second man joined him, then a third. The wards did not come back on. But in the cold air of the trench, in the gray pre-dawn light of the Veldenmarch, something shifted. Not dramatic, not luminescent, not the clean narrative light of divine intervention. Something smaller and more durable. The sound of men choosing, individually and then collectively, to hold the thing they were standing on rather than let the thing in the wheel convince them it was already lost. Yarrick looked at the light in the wheel one more time. Then he looked down the trench at the men on the fire steps. "Stand to," he said. The Covenant came with the wheel, not the tower-mounted reliquary that remained in no man's land, turning, casting its cold white light across the wire and the mud in the faces of the men on the fire steps. What came forward were carriers, 8 of them, bearing smaller wheels on poles the way the first rank had carried them the night before. But these were lit from within, the same cold white emanating from their hubs, and the men behind them were not singing the measured hymn of the previous advance. They were silent. The silence of the Covenant moving in a devotional quiet was considerably more unsettling than the singing had been. And Yarrick noted several men on the fire steps react to it physically before their discipline caught up with their instincts. He let them react. Reaction was honest. Suppression was where problems accumulated. The advance reached the wire at a different point than the previous night. Further west, away from the northeast corner where the repulse had happened, probing the section's response capacity at an untested location. Yarrick had expected this. He had repositioned 2 of Farrick's fire teams to the western approaches 2 hours before dawn, based on the same reading of the Covenant's adjustment logic that had told him the northeast wards were the primary target the previous day. Ferrick had asked no questions and repositioned with the quiet efficiency of a sergeant who had stopped needing explanations and started needing only confirmation that the person giving orders knew what they were looking at. The wire held the advance's first contact. Fire from Ferrick's repositioned teams hit the second rank, but the carried wheels were doing something to the wire. Not cutting it, the light from the wheel hubs was touching the wire sections nearest the carriers, and the wire was not parting but losing coherence. The individual strands softening, the entanglement geometry degrading, not through physical force, but through whatever mechanism the Covenant's reliquary weapons operated on. The same mechanism that had extinguished the wards, applied not to a metaphysical defensive structure, but to a physical one. And the effect was slower, but it was working. Yarrick watched 2 meters of wire become navigable in approximately 40 seconds. He filed this under significant and moved. The western fire step was 30 meters from the nearest breach point when the first Covenant soldiers pushed through the softened wire. They came through in close order, still silent, the wheel carriers remaining outside the wire to maintain whatever field the reliquaries projected. The men coming through were unburdened, moving fast, and they were in the trench before the section's rate of fire could be adjusted to cover the breach point effectively. Close quarters, timber walls, the smell of mud and candle wax, and the specific metallic sharpness of the wheel light that Yarrick could now identify as a physical sensation. A pressure behind the bale eye's aperture. Or a resistance, as though whatever the light consisted of was testing the mechanism of the augmetic, the way a lockpick tests a tumbler. He stepped into the breach point and the power claw opened. He had used it for 50 years. It had been his left arm for 50 years, the physical consequence of a fight with a creature that had not expected a human commissar to get back up. And it had become, over that time, less a weapon and more an extension of his particular approach to problems. Direct, final, stripped of ambiguity. It was not elegant. It had never been elegant. In the confined space of the trench, it was enormously effective. The first 2 Covenant soldiers through the breach encountered it and were stopped. The third had the presence of mind to go low, under the claw's arc, and came up with a blade, a short weapon, blessed, the metal carrying the same cold white luminescence as the wheel hubs. And the blade found the gap between Yarrick's coat and his right arm, and opened a cut along the outside of his forearm that was, objectively, not serious, and which he noted and set aside. He took the man's weapon hand with the claw and redirected it into the trench wall. The 4th and 5th soldiers came through together and were taken by Ferrick's men, who had moved up behind Yarrick in the time it had taken him to process the first 3. Ferrick himself was a large man with economical habits, and the breach point became a great deal less useful to the Covenant in the 10 seconds following Ferrick's arrival. The wheel light was intensifying. Yarrick could feel it the way you feel artillery before you hear it. In the body, below cognition, a vibration that had no frequency you could name, but was unambiguously present. The bale eye was pushing back against it automatically, the red aperture cycling through adjustments, and the combination produced in his vision a layering effect. The physical trench overlaid with something else, a second geography, the same ground rendered in the Covenant's theological cartography, where no man's land was sacred territory, and the wire was an affront, and the men behind it were obstacles in a forward motion that had been in progress since before any of them had been born. He understood it. He had always been able to understand the internal logic of other people's absolutes. Understanding them had never once made him sympathetic to their operational conclusions. He turned to face the wheel light directly. It was coming from the largest carrier, a man who had pushed through the breach behind his fellows and was standing in the trench with the pole-mounted wheel raised above his head, the cold white light falling from it in sheets, and his face carrying the expression Yarrick had seen in the detention dugout 2 days ago. The absolute peace of a man who has surrendered himself entirely and found the surrender liberating. The light was doing something to the trench walls around him. The mud was not drying exactly, but clarifying. The material reality of it becoming briefly less insistent, as though the light was suggesting that the mud was a temporary condition and the permanent one lay in a different direction. The men near him were affected. Yarrick could see it, the subtle wavering, the loosening of grip, the expression of men hearing something they couldn't quite resolve into words, but which was asking them to put down what they were holding. Yarrick walked toward the carrier through the light. It pushed back, physically, not violently. It was not the brute force of a shock wave, but the resistance of a current, of moving through water that had opinions about the direction of travel. The Bale Eye's pressure increased. He could feel the cut on his forearm, and he noted it again and set it aside again and kept walking. The carrier watched him come. The absolute peace did not leave his face, but something entered it, a new element, not fear, not doubt, but the specific adjustment of a man whose framework is encountering something it did not account for. A dead man walking toward the light and not stopping, not being stopped. Yarrick reached the pole. He put the power claw around the shaft below the wheel and looked at the carrier and said, in a voice that was between the two of them and no one else, "Your God wants you moving forward. Mine wanted me dead, and I'm still here. Let go of the pole." The carrier held for 3 seconds. The peace in his face was doing work. Yarrick could see it working, the faith substrate engaging with the challenge, processing it. 3 seconds was a long time in a trench, in close contact. Then the carrier let go. Yarrick brought the claw closed. The pole shattered. The wheel hit the trench floor, and the light went out. Not gradually, not in diminuendo, but with the clean completeness of a candle extinguished. The same way the wards had gone dark. The same absolute cessation. The second geography disappeared. The mud reasserted itself. The trench became simply a trench. In the tower in no man's land, the great wheel stopped turning. The Covenant pulled back. It took 20 minutes, conducted in the same devotional silence as the advance. And when it was complete, the breach in the wire had been abandoned, and the approaches were empty, and the gray morning light was reasserting its jurisdiction over no man's land with the flat indifference it brought to everything. Yarrick stood in the breach point and watched them go and breathed and let the knee be bad and felt the forearm bleeding in a minor and inconvenient way and watched the Veldenmarch come back to itself. Dreher appeared. He had blood on his coat that was not his. He was holding a field dressing with the air of someone who has decided to have this particular argument. Mike Yarrick accepted the field dressing without comment. "Sir," Dreher said, as Yarrick bound the forearm with the efficient minimalism of a man who had done this before in worse circumstances without help. The wheel, in the tower, it stopped. "Yes. The men are saying, I know what the men are saying. Is it true?" Yarrick finished the binding. He looked at the tower in no man's land. The damaged structure, the great iron wheel now motionless on its mounting, the cold white light gone entirely, the object reduced to what it physically was. Old iron shaped by hands, invested with meaning by the people who had made it and the people who had feared it. An object, significant because of the significance given to it, powerful because enough people believed it was. He understood that principle completely. He had built his career on it. And he was in his private assessment one of the foremost practitioners alive of the art of making significance stick. "Tell them what you saw," he said to Dreher. "Exactly what you saw, not what it meant, what it was, what I did, what the section did." He paused. "Can you do that?" Dreher thought about it with the seriousness of someone being given a real task. "Yes, sir." "Then do that." Yarrick turned from the tower. "Find Farrick. Tell him the breach needs to be wired before the Covenant decides the ground is worth the cost of a third attempt. Tell Annex 1 want the northeast fire step manned at double strength until I say otherwise. Find Captain Soul and tell him I will present myself at the rear command post this afternoon, weather and enemy activity permitting." He began walking. "And find me something to eat. I haven't eaten since I came out of the mud, and the situation is becoming distracting." Dreher almost smiled. Almost. He was 19 and he had been in the Veldenmarch for 14 months, and smiling was a complicated transaction at that age in that place. But he almost managed it, and then he went to find Farrick. Yarrick walked the line. The men watched him pass. The devotional stillness was still there. He did not expect it to leave quickly, and he was not certain it would leave entirely. And he had made his peace with that in the small hours of the previous night. when he had understood that there was no version of his presence here that did not carry the weight of what had happened in the mud at the section's eastern lip. He had not asked for it. He could not refuse it. What he could do, what he had always done, was manage the distance between the story and the function, keep the story from substituting for the function, ensure that the men who looked at him with the icon eyes also understood that the icon carried a power claw and red ground and knew what an 8-centimeter fire step discrepancy meant and would tell you to get the drainage sump cleared. Rother was waiting at the command dugout door. His face had the arrangement of a man who had watched everything that had happened in the last hour from a specific vantage point and was now performing a private recalculation that would take some time to complete. Yarrick stopped in front of him. "The inquiry," Yarrick said. "The inquiry," Rother said carefully, "has encountered new data." "It has. The determination has been postponed, pending further observation." "Reasonable," Yarrick said. They stood in the trench doorway in the gray morning and looked at each other with the particular regard of two men who have not resolved their fundamental disagreement and are adult enough to know they probably won't, and who have decided to be useful to each other anyway, because the alternative is worse. "The Marshal still wants to see you," Rother said. "The Marshal will see me," Yarrick said. "This afternoon. Tell him to have maps." He went inside. The Velden March held that morning, and the morning after, and the one after that. Yarrick presented himself to Marshal Corvath on the third day, in a meeting that lasted 4 hours and resolved nothing theologically and established everything operationally. By the end of it, the Marshal had Yarrick's assessment of the Covenant's reliquary weapon mechanics. His analysis of 3 additional fronts he had reviewed on the ride to the rear command post, and a list of 14 structural recommendations for the St. Ambrose salient's defensive works. Yarrick had the Marshal's provisional and deeply qualified tolerance, a formal designation as tactical advisor of ambiguous origin, and a standing invitation to the next full ecclesiastical inquiry, which he intended to attend and which he suspected would be equally inconclusive. Rother continued the inquiry. It continued for a long time. No determination was reached that satisfied everyone, which meant it had reached the only determination available to honest examination of genuinely ambiguous phenomena. The men of Section 9 called him the Commissar eventually, and let the saint part settle into the background where it flavored everything without being stated directly. The way faith works when it is functioning correctly, present in the load-bearing structure, invisible in the finish. Dreyer was promoted to sergeant. Annex held the northeast fire step through 2 more Covenant advances before the winter made large operations impractical on both sides. Ferrick fixed the drainage sump. The great wheel in no man's land did not turn again. The Covenant did not abandon it. They maintained it, kept the tower repaired, kept the wheel mounted and visible. But the cold white light did not return. And over the weeks and months it became simply part of the landscape, the way all sufficiently old things in a sufficiently long war become landscape, familiar and no longer frightening. Yarrick was not certain what he had done to it. He was not certain it mattered. He was certain that the line held, which was the metric he had always used, the only one that had ever seemed to him to be fully honest about what wars actually cost and what they actually required. He did not know how long he would remain in the Velden March. He did not know if there was a way back to whatever came after death, or if the mud had simply decided to return him because he had been insufficiently finished, or if something larger had a specific use for a commissar in a world where faith and firepower operated the same mechanisms. He suspected, on balance, showed that the question was less important than the function. Somewhere beyond the Covenant's lines, the war continued. Somewhere in the rear echelon, Rother was writing careful sentences in his codex about ambiguous instruments and their operational parameters. Somewhere in the dark, whatever had been in the wheel was considering its options. The trench was cold. The mud was patient. The line held. Yarrick stood the watch.